panelist is absent here, so I'll fill in for that panelist. And 4 of us will do it, or 5 of us, 15 minutes each. And then we'll open the floor for an exchange and possibly give Professor Mamdani 5 minutes to talk. Let me start by saying that Mamdani is a brand. And like all brands, it is a marketable commodity. Scholars in the marketplace, Mamdani is bought and sold in Kampala, in South Africa, the Post-Apartheid Academy, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nigeria on the continent. If Mamdani had regional and continental market in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, and the new millennium, it became a global brand. Celebrating him will be asking for too much because every day that he is quoted, cited, he is being celebrated. So instead of celebrating Mahmood, it will be better for us to engage his works because there is a curious irony about his career. Mahmood has spent 40 decades plus hanging Africanists. Ironically, it is those Africanists that engage his work, not continental Africans. Let me start with a personal. I met Mahmood in the library, not physically. I met his book, Politics and Class Formation, at the Kashim Ibrahim Library in Ahmadu Bello as an undergraduate in 1978. I took that book, knowing the man, read it, but then Arnold Temu was my professor, and I got exposed to what was happening in that then called the Dar debate. I was to meet Mahmood only in 1985 when he came to Toronto. By then I was a graduate student, to talk about farming as man-made, not a natural disaster. This was during Obote II. We were to meet again in 1993 at Urbana-Champaign, a conference organized by Bill Martin and Michael West. The next time I met Mahmood was in Cape Town, where he generously hired me as his field commander in the battle against the Bantu Academy at UCT. What I want to do is to look at Mahmood's contribution to what I call citizenship studies. Please let us be clear about this. Citizenship studies, not to citizenship. They are not the same. Mahmood's contribution to citizenship studies have to be viewed within the context of what I call his trilogy. The first is citizen and subject. The second is when victims becomes killer. And the third is savior and survivors. Now, to understand citizen and subject, you have to read the other two. If not, you don't get Mahmood. That's my reading. But to get to the trilogy, you need to start with his autobiographical book, from refugee to citizen. That is where Mahmood starts laying the groundwork for what would, in my view, become citizen and subject, then fleshed out in savior and survivor, and also when victim becomes killers. When you look at from refugee to citizen, you'll see how Mahmood begins to play with history in understanding the making of Asian identity, colonial identity, and, of course, prefiguring the post-colonial identity, because the issue he was trying to grapple with was, why did Amin just wake up and say, hey, look, Asians came here to build railways. The railway is over, so they can go. This was in 1971, 1972. Since Citizen and Subject was published in 1996, Mahmood has gone down in history as constantly saying, repeating himself ad nauseum, that I am a social scientist that is historically informed. Maybe that is the variant of the tiger and the tigritude. Well, I'm a historian. I cannot claim to historicize. I have to historicize, because that is my profession. Mahmood can historicize because he's not a historian. He's a political scientist. I think that's a key distinction to make, because Citizen and Subject has been read as an historical text, and it is not an historical text. We can argue about that. But it does open, in my view, the door to understanding his contribution to citizenship studies. That book is divided into two. The first part deals with subjecthood. The second part deals with resistance. But they are not divided, they are linked. Because what goes into making subjecthood is refracted to struggles. And Mahmood says that the very history that influences the making of the peasant on the indirect rule is the very force that creates the context for the resistance. There is a dialectic between both. And he insists that even in the post-colonial state, every attempt to remake that state reproduces the fault line of that state. He reminds us that no one wrote how Africa was ruled. What concerned us was Europe underdeveloped Africa. Of course, that is coming from Mahmood's own history in Dar es Salaam, where the dominant school was political economy. But when you read the Citizen and Subject, savior, survivor, when victim becomes killer, you begin to see the transformation, because Mahmood is questioning the political economy method. Not that he throws it away, like Adiembo argues in his review of the book, but that he uses it in more creative ways. I mean, Mahmood is a record to saying that then everything had a political economy. Now, if everything had a political economy then, why would everything not have a political economy now? The second book in that trilogy deals with Rwanda. You see, notice Citizen and Subject was a methodological expose. It deals with the making of subjecthood and with resistance. The key empirical areas there were South Africa and what Mahmood repeatedly refers to as the equatorial academy, meaning his own part of Africa, East Africa, etc. But what comes out in the second and third is an empirical case of first Rwanda and then Sudan. Rwanda, genocide. Sudan, quote unquote, near genocide. Because if you listen to what Wale was saying yesterday, Wale's anti-Islamic tendencies slip through. He talked about Sudan as Africans being killed by Arabs. And the example from that place is completely different, because Mahmoud goes beyond the present. He looks at the construction of the Mahdi state, and he goes beyond the Mahdi state. Consultant, and therefore, going back to 1500. In that area, identity have been skewed, fluid, made, and remade, to the extent that you will put somebody dark skin and somebody light skin on the right, both will tell you they are Arabs. How do you make up who is not? I mean, the first time I went to Saudi Arabia, right at the airport, the potters that were doing the lodge, the trolley, the man was dark, stunned, asking, "Are you a Saudi?" He said, "Yes, I'm a Saudi." I said, "Wow." So the question of race comes in Darfur. But Mahmoud rails against the Save Darfur campaign, which was saying that Arabs were killing Africans. You know. He tries to pull together sources from political science, anthropology, sociology, folklore, history, to understand the way race or Arabization, and the result is stunning, i.e., what happened in Darfur has something to do with citizenship, claim to land, identity, which was exacerbated by environmental factors. You have on the one hand the Zagawa grazing, and you had the other group, sedentary. Desertification and movement down south complicated this. And then militias were formed, and then violence. But then people started staking claims to who owns a Dar and who is Darless. And then, of course, the context of the Cold War, it exploded. Rwanda was slightly different, because again, he uses generously from Archie's Lacostrine area, but he also engages the court historian in Rwanda, Kagame. He's arguing that Hutu and Tutsi have to be examined in the light of origin, tradition, and in the light of how they were made and remade over time. It's about Queen Utura, the cultural framework to which a Hutu can become Tutsi. But then under colonialism, again, things, I mean, it's crazy that in contemporary Africa, when you talk about colonialism, people say, "Oh no, forget about that. It happened a long time ago." But every in life in contemporary Africa is shaped by that past, and you cannot understand the history. So Mahmoud sets up what he calls political identities in Rwanda. The native and the settlers, the indigene and the settler. Now, this is not peculiar to Rwanda. We find it today in contemporary Nigeria. Everywhere you go, there are natives and there are settlers. by making 3 points. The first is slightly a repeat of what I've just touched on, i.e., Mahmoud has against Africanist. The famous formulation with respect to the Qatar folks in Atlanta, Mahmoud calls it Africanist scholarship made in the USA. But these folks in the USA, these Africanists, are the people that engage your work. How do you do that? The second point is when you look at the trilogy, what stands out is the ethnic and quote-unquote the tribal in the making and remaking of citizenship. First, in Mahmoud's words, the state was de-racialized, but then the state was not actually Mahmoud argues that every group wants their own they want their own space in the post-colony. And that leads to a re-tribalization of politics. But when Mahmoud talks about Rwanda, Mahmoud doesn't talk about the Twa who are in Rwanda. But we always forget them. Why? We are also excluding them from citizenship in the scholarship. Mahmoud does not talk about minorities, the youth, women, and neither does he talk about the Khoisan in South Africa. The third point is that if ethnicity or tribe are the woof and woof of citizenship in Africa, and arguably, globally, what is wrong with tribalism? If it is a global phenomenon, I think Wale even alluded to that yesterday. If it is, though I doubt that, because the way tribalism is practiced in Africa, I'm sure our practice, implicates our history, culture, and tradition. If that is the case, then we are dealing with a universal category here. I mean, recall the arguments 60s, 70s in South Africa and elsewhere in the First World, where Marxists were arguing that, look, capitalism is implicated in race, and that with the further development of productive forces, racism will cease to exist. Racism has not ceased to exist. Capital thrives on race. So I wonder if citizenship is not anchored or race universally, precisely because of that functionality. I stop here. Thank you. I'll give the floor to Madam Tedase to say what she wants to say about our friend, Mahmood Mamdani.
See the advantage of being a chair and a speaker at the same time. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. First, I have to thank the organizers of this conference for having confidence in me and assuming that I would be able to deliver a tribute to such a distinguished scholar, and I only found out on Friday. So allow me not to do a scholarly trajet as my friend just did. I first came, so I would make it slightly more personal, as I have not really, first I don't want to repeat the works that were just cited. I was going to do the regular thing and say, you know, he has published zillions of books and articles and all that. And instead, please allow me to give a personal account of how I met Mahmood and what my takeaway lessons has been from the privilege of being mentored by him over a long period of time. I first met Mahmood when he came to a Kodesria General Assembly in 1984. And I was hosted in Kodesria, but located in another organization. And what I found extremely fascinating was this person that found out once he came to Dakar that he has lost his citizenship in Uganda, and he was violently fighting for it. And this is a person, unlike what we said yesterday, who wasn't really eager to be in the diaspora, but really wanted to stay in Uganda. But as was said earlier, he was asked to leave Uganda by a military dictator. Dictator and his documented history as a refugee. He came back to Uganda and was established in the university. But then Abote didn't quite like what he was writing about. And regardless of his first experience of being displaced from the country, he continued to be critically engaged with Ugandan politics, and the new powers didn't quite like his interventions in that scene. So when he came to Dakar, he found out that he can no longer go back to Uganda because they had canceled his passport. And so my first remembrance of Mahmood Mamdani is this person constantly for his Ugandan citizenship. And that, I think, is one of his, the thing I learned from him, as I happened to also be a refugee at that time, was if you have a commitment, you then have to fight for it. And being in exile or in the diaspora, I heard these last few days is not sufficient enough to do the type of work he's committed in doing. The next encounter I had with Mahmood was, as you know, this 1980s, when African universities were hugely challenged by structural adjustment, the so-called book famine, where our libraries were really crumbling, and so forth. And Kodesria wanted to send, in that visit, during that visit of Mahmood to Kodesria, he became a member of the committee. And I would get back to that in a short while. But one of the things that Kodesria wanted to do, along with other colleagues in the South, was to go and visit universities, research centers in southern countries and see if their initiative was viable in Africa. And he and Claude Ake were the ones, and Tandika, who went to Brazil and other places and visited these research institutions, that as a possibility in the context of African universities being totally destroyed. Scholars were to do in these institutions that were really crumbling. On return to Uganda, and he did return to Uganda after a valiant struggle to re-establish himself as a Ugandan citizen, was to set up the Center for Basic Research. But that, and a lot of other African scholars have set up so-called independent research centers. Codesria, he and his colleagues used the resources allocated for small grants program to establish a center as well as do their work. So I was inspired by that, because at that particular moment in the late 1980s, Codesria a research vehicle that we called the National Working Groups. And indeed, a lot of African scholars wrote books into a group and wrote books, published it, and circulated it. But to my knowledge, I don't know of any other grantee that used the resources and additional ones and research center. So this book that came out through this effort and which focused on labor was my first introduction to the capacity of Mahmood to raise new questions that were not raised before. And this study that he undertook with colleagues from Uganda, mostly other graduate students who were in the University of Makerere, was to question the notion that labor was just only wage labor. So they looked much more into labor forms, particularly in the rural areas, and published this book within the Codesria framework, but focused on Uganda. And as he reminded us yesterday, a classical approach of political economy, using political economy as a framework to do this work, but also questioning, however, what existed before in terms of labor within Uganda. And the second thing I learned from Mahmood was his commitment to building a library. For an additional very small grant from Codesria, built what they call a skeleton library, but that inspired them enough to raise more funds from citizens of Uganda and built a very robust library within the Center for Basic Research. And the theme of the research and the subsequent book was Uganda Studies in Labor, and was edited by Mahmood. And one of my takeaway message looking through the book include at least two concerns that Mahmood continues to underscore in most of his reflections since then, which I think remains relevant to the current concerns with the crisis of globalization that we've been discussing these last few days. And these include that there can be no single prescription for the African crisis or the crisis for globalization, to make it more current. As he has reminded us since then, in Africa, is not, should not be confused with the sameness, that Africans can have similar experiences, but we should always pay heed to the specificity of historical experience. When he did edit this book, he indicated an interest that I have had a discomfort with his work since then, which is almost allergic to gender analysis. That is not very kind, but perhaps can be supported through looking at works. And in this particular book, I found, looking back, that he talked about his colleagues in the book. Oh, my time is over. 5 minutes. Oh, God, not as good. That he said that they did talk about the division of labor, but none goes beyond the process of production and leaves out the process of reproduction. So what was interesting to me, and I have raised this in another forum, is that when he did write the book Citizen and Subject, which really, at the core of it, forced labor, to me at least, from a feminist perspective, is heavily about social reproduction of people in the rural areas. And by the time Mahmoud wrote that book in 1996, there was a whole host of literature about how gender was really critical to the reproduction of labor in African rural areas, particularly in areas of forced labor and so forth. But to be sure, while gender is mentioned here and there, Mahmoud does not engage in this seminal work of his magnum opus, as it were, about the role of gender in social reproduction in Africa and women in the anti-colonial struggle. And we've learned since then that they played not only a very, very active part, but in the areas that he covers, they were almost always the first ones to have resisted labor migration and generally the colonial oppression. And I always felt that that particular book and his subsequent works would be much, much more enriched if our colleague was to engage in gender analysis as an analytical category. But since then, what I have found very his current preoccupation with decolonizing the African university. Given 5 minutes, I'm going to skip a lot of what I wanted to say. Perhaps we'll have a chance to get back to it later. But since the overtake of our universities by structural adjustment in the World Bank, Mahmoud has been very concerned about decolonizing our universities. And what's really happening, to my knowledge, is one of the few, or perhaps even the only scholar who has looked into the impact of structural adjustment and neoliberal overtake of our institutions in what it has meant to teach and to do research. And I think that's his most current and very fruitful contribution to, now nobody gave him those kinds of papers, you realize. But in any case, I am particularly of decolonizing the African university and what it means, both in terms of what to teach, how to carry out research, and who decides really what kind of teaching that we should engage in, and do we transform the university. And what I find very promising for the rest of us, because a university that has been taken over by neoliberal institutions, but our entire continent. And I think we saw some of the impact of that also in this conference. And so when he talks about decolonizing, my takeaway, and it's much more profound and I cannot articulate it in 2 minutes, he thinks that we should, and I quote him, the alternative to just having a Western type of university, which we have had since colonialism, since the colony, is to theorize our own reality and to strike the right balance between the local and the global as we do so. The local production of knowledge unfolds in relation to a complex of social forces and takes account of a society's needs and demands, its capacities and aspirations. So this idea of our ability to theorize our own reality, as simple as it might sound, is, I think, quite profound and perhaps a way to transform our institutions and our futures, addressing the crisis of globalization and so forth. And not only has he created institutions, Tandika yesterday talked about Samir, is a legacy of Samir, is the creation of institutions. I would say the same about Mamdani. Not only the Center for Basic Research, which I mentioned earlier, but also the Makerere University Research Center that he heads at the moment, where this whole discussion about how do you concretely decolonize an Africa is taking place. And I think a closer study by all of us of this experience would inspire us to do similar things in other African institutions. And I am hoping, since my friend Leone is on this institution, he's changed his negligence of gender issues and will engage with issues of great concern to us and the African continent. We cannot decolonize Africa without also taking this challenge. So my take, if I may conclude, Mr. Chair, is that Mahmood, what I have learned from Mahmood is to really be brave enough to speak truth to power. As you all know, he teaches the University of Columbia, and most of the scholars in the diaspora that do not engage in a critical reflection about the oppressions and dislocations within the United States. But he is brave enough to talk about what is wrong in terms of realities in the United States, be it religious issues or political issues in the contemporary United States. And that, to me, is the real sign of a public intellectual who does continuously talk directly to truth to power wherever he's at, not just in our continent, which he continues to do. And also, the second thing I have learned from him is his capacity to destabilize this notion of African scholars being in the diaspora. He absolutely insists on his location in both places. He is in the University of Columbia, but he's also in Uganda for half of the year. And more interestingly, and in conclusion, what I have found interesting about his location and his mobility is that he goes to a number of African universities where he receives honorary degrees. I don't know why they give him honorary degree. I don't think he needs it, but in any event, he has received honorary degrees in quite a number of universities, and he has used these occasions to engage students in those universities about this new thinking of decolonizing, the ability for them to see their future and to decide their own future. And I also find that very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Professor Deportation, please.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organization. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you who are already in the evening somewhere. Just a message from Professor Wamba. He sent his greetings to friends. He suffered from a heartbeat, so he had to go and see a cardiologist. That's why he couldn't hear. He sends his greetings to friends and others. So, yes, I noticed that on the program I was listed as DRC, partly because of my hesitation as to how to list myself, since I'm a sort of vagabond. I go back and forth now between California, where we live part of the year, and Brazil, where I started going into, invited by the University of, Federal University of Bahia, these personal things. But I would like to touch on 5 points. First of all, I want to point out, as I said to that celebration, I shall do it in the way in which I learned to do it at the University of Dar es Salaam, where I first met Mahmood in 1975. In other words, we would battle, and then after the battle, we would go and have a beer at the sort of on the street. I remember famously when Professor Ranger came to Dar es Salaam. He came from Zimbabwe, and he was surprised that he was not being invited to speak at the university. And everyone was there at this Thursday seminar, which actually had been inaugurated by Ranger himself. He was there, including Mahmood. And Professor Ranger was so criticized when he was taken back to his hotel by one of our colleague. You know, I felt as if I was a graduate student. Yes, Thursday seminars were all about, you battle, and then you discuss, you engage, etc. I'm going to touch on 5 points. One is globalization of what? 2, I'm going to talk about a thesis. I was part of the examination board. It happened in February 9th at the University of Campinas. And the thesis was in Portuguese, Tacteando o Indizível, something like looking for how to say the unsayable. And I think that is a very, very crucial point if one is going to decolonize African history, in fact, to decolonize the mindset of colonization. And then the third point, which in fact is really throughout my presentation, is the role of Cheikh Anta Diop in actually decolonizing knowledge, long before really anyone, and then followed, of course, by Aiko Arma, who set up but much more than a publishing outfit, a group known as Shem Shubak, which is a cooperative ancient Egyptian text, so that they could be available to anybody who is interested in making sure that African history does not just simply start from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And then the fourth point, this time, he's already cutting his pieces of paper, the issue of artificial intelligence and human intelligence. I think it is upon us, it's part of this crisis, and I'm going to try and explain how to understand human intelligence by one particular group to present it as the only one. Wait. And in the conclusion, he said, I have 10 minutes, I've been told. The conclusion is that it seems to me that if humanity is going to save itself in the face of the destruction, dehumanization of capitalism, then one has to do away with hierarchization of knowledge, in the same way that, yes, it's easy to do away with hierarchization of race, but then that has to be followed by de-hierarchization of how do we know? Let's suppose, just imagine, aren't those people in the equatorial forest, long before the scientists, that there was something wrong in the atmosphere? They must have felt it, but who did they have to go and say around the planet, right? The Mbuti, the Batwa, as IB said. Oh, very, very quickly, because the minutes are flying. If one looks at the current situation, you can't just simply say capitalism, because capitalism, the way it is today, is a cumulative impact of genocide of the indigenous people everywhere on the planet. It's the cumulative injustices provoked by enslavement, colonization, apartheid, and now neoliberalism. In other words, the pillars of capitalism are so powerful and embedded in previous phases that to destroy it, you actually have to go back and see, for example, how the Native Americans, Crazy Horse, Black Elk, reacted to how they were being wiped out from the surface of the planet, and how other people felt that. But how do you do that? We don't know. But then we enter into this arena where we say we need reparation. How are we going to calculate reparation and then be paid in the currency of that very process of destruction and dehumanization? My view is that it is impossible to calculate reparation. And therefore, the best way one can do this is actually move away from the system as radically as possible. And so, this thesis, looking for the unsayable, briefly from my own experience, that's why I felt that this thesis really needs to be published as quickly as possible. The thesis is a dialogue between Isabel Noronha, a filmmaker, psychoanalyst at the same time. She did a fantastic movie on the great artist in Mozambique, Malangatana. And it's a dialogue between her and Camilo Souza, who entered the ranks of Frelimo very, very young and fought in the zones, confronted with reactions, statements that he thought that he had done something wrong and he should never have entered Frelimo. For example, he arrives in Dar es Salaam, there are 6 people around the table, and one of them stands up that we have a CIA agent among ourselves. So immediately Camilo figures, I've taken the wrong decision. And he doesn't know who to speak to. That's unsayable. So eventually, somebody the next day goes and talks to him. He's trying to figure out how to leave Dar es Salaam. And the guy says to him, look, really, that's what he does. But the point is, nobody around the table defended Camilo. Now, and say, look, people have asked me, why did you keep your Belgian name, or etc. People, our process, speaking about citizenship, there was a time we were non-existent as mulattoes. My father, who was taking care of the education, did not know where we should go for an education. Should we go to a semi-demi school, as my older brother used to say, describing ourselves, or should we go to a black school? My father had been told, if you marry this woman, 5 minutes, yes, okay. If you marry this woman, forget about your career. But my father wanted to marry my mother. My mother barely knew how to write her name. But my mother's knowledge was unfathomable. This is, of course, something that I learned along the way, at the table, at home, and French. She never wanted to speak French because she knew that we, the kids, were going to laugh at the mistakes, etc. But she understood French. So I learned from that kind of position that you find yourself not being able to say. When a Jesuit at the school eventually tried to kiss me, I resisted, crying. He didn't succeed. But who was I going to speak to? And there's a famous text from ancient Egypt. Discussion of a man between his bar. And that text, there's a part of the text that says, to whom shall I speak today? He's desperate, this person. And it goes on for about 15 stanzas. And it's exactly like today. Who shall I speak today in this kind of situation? It's chaos. Friends are no longer friends. Brothers are no longer brothers. Everyone is stealing from everybody. That is a dispute of a man between his bar. We haven't done that in our little group, but we did something, a text that exists, but we have done it and translated in 9 African languages and 3 colonial languages. And that text is known as the Eloquent Peasant. Here, in that text, you have a peasant really giving a lesson to the Pharaoh about what justice is about. Even though the Pharaoh, knowledge, the Pharaoh is supposed to be the person who is really the guarantor of justice, etc. when I'm leaving school, could I have 2-3 extra minutes, Mr. Chair? The fourth point, but when I'm leaving school, the rector of the school, now my mother had just passed the year before. He advises me, he says, I hope you marry a white person. Who am I going to talk about this? To my father? So you are left not knowing what to say. And this is universal. So if there is going to be decolonization, then there has to be of these archives of the unthinkable, of the unsayable, etc. And that leads to de-hierarchization of knowledge. Artificial intelligence versus human intelligence. Instinctively, people say that human intelligence is superior to artificial intelligence. But what are we saying? What are we seeing today? That artificial intelligence is actually taking over. Dehumanized, humans are being robotized, because people say, oh, well, the robots are... Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got 2 minutes. I forgot to say something that is crucial. I've not touched really on the details about Cheikh Anta Diop's work, but there is a movie, a documentary, known as Kemtiu. It's available in a DVD, Présence Africaine in Paris. The French version, the original, is available for 25 euros, $25. And it's a documentary. I've seen it about 6 or 7 times, and every time I see it, I see things, I understand things I did not understand before. Cheikh Anta Diop was the decolonizer way ahead of his time. And one of the persons who has best understood that is Aikwe Arma. Aikwe Arma understood Cheikh Anta Diop pretty much like me, except Cheikh Mbake Diop, the son of Cheikh Anta Diop, who wrote the biography. So I'm trying to point out that there are voices who have kind of remained muted, sidelined, that really have to be heard. And you know, I used to learn to say, Cheikh Anta is okay, but there are problems. Of course there are problems. But Cheikh Anta said things that were not sayable. And that's why Senghor, for example, you know, made sure that he was sidelined. When he presented, he defended his thesis, 6 hours, almost 7 hours, without a paper. He frightened the examination board. And the examination board made sure that he got a grade below what would allow him to actually teach at university level and supervise research. So this is my appeal. I hope that we have questions, and then we can talk more than these few minutes that we are given respite of. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your generosity.
Professor Diouf, please.
Afternoon. I guess I was selected by the to participate in the celebration of Professor Mamdani because he's at Columbia University and has been my neighbor in the same street for almost 20 years. We are both members of the Middle Eastern, Asian, and African studies. in addition to Tandika, who is my eternal boss, Mamdani was also my boss as the president of Codestria when I was working there. For the last 2 years I was working there. Today I'm boss because I'm the chair of the department he's teaching me. And this is quite interesting revenge. But one thing is he has been one of the most active actors of a department in which the faculty has been keen in reinventing only and also in trying to create what they call a post-disciplinary treatment. And of these actually has been the creation of a program which is called which is thinking about pre-colonial Arab-speaking Africa. Is, if you want, part of his thinking about redefining African studies, about the way in which African studies has been framed for 50 years. And the Ifriqiya program has been a very important, successful program which began at Columbia but is now linked in Uganda and has been having a kind of very interesting repercussion. And if you want to follow a little bit what has been going on, you can look at Sesame, which is a review in which Mahmood just published a series of papers by colleagues and students on slavery. And again, the same drinking slavery in a larger context than the context of the Atlantic. This is just to show that Mahmood has been part of my intellectual life for a long time. I think in 1991, when Codestria organized the meeting on academic freedom and the social responsibility of intellectuals in Africa, and I was asked to co-edit the proceeding of the conference, the book African Freedom and the Social of Intellectual. Our conversation continued, and it is a conversation minded political scientist and a self-proclaimed dissident historian, a follower of Tagore who believed that history of non-Western society should be about daily life, not political affair. And I think it's interesting to see that Mahmood consciously is always trying to shift the discussion, you know, from a political scientist or a political economy discussion, which is much more historically grounded. And to show that, I would like to quote the late Kenyan historian Acheno Jambo, who in his discussion of Mahmood's citizen and subject conclude his review by the following line. Mamdani is East African Tocqueville in South Africa, learning, listening, and interpreting Africa long 20th century. Where they differ is in Mamdani's seeming abandonment of class analysis with his book Politics and Class Formation in Uganda, 1972. The weapon with in favor of an eclectic is respectable Renaissance type, the vast amount of African literature. The author may demur, but in a non-intended way, he has resuscitated the colonial archive and given it another lease of life. Valentine argued that the African scholar has not got much choice over this method and material. Vive Lord Lugat. And I think it's important because this conclusion captures, if you want, Mahmood's main ambition, and his double ambition. One, to address issues of history and to understand African trajectories in order, based on that, to build a theory which allows us to understand, if you want, the dynamics of African societies. And I can go, Ibrahim did it, from his contribution in the Academic Freedom book to the paper he has written, Tandika and Wajamba, on African social movement, to the book he has edited. But I think the two books that captured the discussion about what Mahmood is in subject and when victims become killers. And if you want, his theoretical discussion is much more present in the Du Bois lectures he has given, titled Define and Rule, but also just in the last bulletin, which was distributed this morning, his discussion of neochromas, I think it's the name, on the way he's reading Citizen and Subject. And Citizen and Subject has a new edition with a new preface by Mahmood Mamdani. It was just published this year, where he's responding in particular historians who has been engaging with him in a very vigorous way. And I think it's important, and as you know, I am a historian, so of course I'm part of this discussion. But I think it's interesting to read the Neochroma, his reaction to Neocosmo, who has written two actually pieces. One is in his book, the other is, I think, an article which was published by Africa Development. And it's also interesting to see that his perspective is a perspective he claimed that Mahmood is based on Alain Badiou's approach to both ideology and politics. So I don't want to go back actually to presenting what Mahmood has been working on. But by looking at the criticism, it gives us a way of understanding basically what is at stake. And I'm going to shift to French. Because I think that my Anglophone colleagues, they have to begin learning French. I don't know why I'm going to speak English for them. I'm going to speak to my people. So, le travail de Mahmoud.
Mahmoud's work is very interesting, and I'm doing it on purpose when I say that the French are my people.
Identity or identification is about the way in which the ethnographic discourse which was proposed by colonial governance has been used both to administer African, but as the knowledge base in which African will revolt. So the paradoxical impact of actually colonial governance. So I'm back to French now.
What is interesting in Mahmoud Mamdani's work is the fact that he analyzes the ethnographic analysis rather than the political economy to define the colonial domination. And very quickly, the topics he discussed are the colonialism and its heritage. That is to say, the colonial state and the production of political identity, the political identity which have become very strong would have, to the point that they have been at the basis of a political space in which, on the one hand, we have the colonial administrator to rule, not to rule them, because when you rule them, it means that you are representing, and the Africans are looking for a governance system or a government. And this system is based, if you want, on a discriminating approach, which means that ethnicity is the rule that helps to administer the citizenship, is the rule that helps to rule colonizers. So there is a difference between ethnic management and racial management. This is what we call the buffer state, the fact that the state is a dual and functional state. So I think that based on that analysis, which is in fact a state relation to the literature that exists, at the same time, Mahmoud Mamdani is trying to strongly criticizing of the knowledge that are produced by the African studies. So this work is a work that helps us to reorient the debate, and he wanted to focus on the markets, on the capitalism, on the infrastructure, the government, and the rule of law, but rather to concentrate on the constitution and the constitution of a context which is strongly marked by the political issues, but in a wider historical environment. And I think that this is one of the greatest contribution of Mahmoud Mamdani. It is to understand the political deadlocks of contemporary Africa from the constitution of the public space, as I was saying, from the knowledge from genealogy, which is a colonial dynasty. So very quickly, I would like to end. I have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to say this extraordinary reading of the indirect rule, which helps to open up a debate, which is a large debate on the nature of the colonial state, on the nature of citizenship, on the government and the administration, but also on the differences, the gap between the urban and the rural areas, on the citizenship and the customary. These are very important issues also. So for him, for Mamdani, and I will finish there before concluding the three challenges are faced with during the independence are the challenge of the rationalizing of the city on the one hand, to erase the distinction between the subjects. It is the detribalization of the authority as being a requirement for the nation and for the economic development and for economic growth in a society defined by equality. And I think that these questions are contemporary issues and that they written in a wider story, and this is what explained his commitment to history. Of course, criticisms from the historians in particular with regard to Mahmoud's approach for a very simple reason that the historians are allergic to theory. His colonial state has never existed. There are different colonial states at various levels. So he also thinks that by getting out of the Marxist sphere from the political economy, he does not give great attention to the issue of the land, to the issue of labor, and also to the issue of capital. And they also criticize him or what they call the decentralized despotism, which is also a very important element, but questions the link between the economy and politics, the links between economy and politics, which Mahmoud also was questioning and does not necessarily accept by opposing the labor to the indigenous issue. What I wanted to say, and that's why I really focused on citizens and subject, is that it is a capital, a book which is very important, and it's a concentration of a whole work that has already been set up by the first book of Mahmood Mamdani. His major question is the possible to build democracy in Africa, and what are the inherited which are constraints and also resources, those heritage that we need to take into account in order to be able to produce knowledge that are knowledge to Africa, but also knowledge that are always in relation to the production of social sciences in Africa. I thank you all.
Dr. Lin, also, please.
Good afternoon to you all. I'll restrict my contribution on Professor Mamdani's intellectual legacy to his tenure at Makerere University, which is the context in which I've most keenly encountered him as a scholar and as an intellectual. Ibrahim warned me that I would be speaking from the proverbial inside, so fidelity to both proximity and critical distance. The MPhil PhD interdisciplinary program, which Professor Mamdani founded at MISA in 2012, arrived in the wake of sustained critiques which he and others of his lineage had waged against what they saw as the destructive effects of neoliberalization on higher education. The problem, as defined at the founding of the doctoral program, related to a model of higher education that focuses on overseas training of postgraduate students who are then supposed to return home and provide the intellectual manpower in institutions of higher learning. A related problem that Professor Mamdani saw as characterizing much of the social research conducted in Africa today was that research questions are posed from outside the continent, and intellectual work within the continent is then relegated to providing answers to questions posed by others. So putative researchers were not playing a role in framing Africa's problems, such questions, and their solutions. This seemed an impractical model, as it ultimately precluded the possibility of a meaningful intellectual project grounded on existing conditions. So from the time of Uganda's independence up until 2010, MISA itself had gradually become a home for consultants rather than independent researchers. The situation around required engaging in a sustained critique of the consultancy culture, which presumes that research is all about finding answers to problems defined by a client, and thinking of research as finding answers, not as formulated questions. Professor Mamdani argued that academics in Africa today had no choice but to train postgraduate students in the institutions in which they will have to work. The next generation of African scholars, at least most of them, must be trained at home. This means that the questions of reform have to be tackled alongside that of postgraduate study, so that postgraduate education, research, and institution building form part of a single integrated whole. He also argued that postgraduate education had to be built to the university, not a standalone facility that requires endless injections of external funding and input. In this regard, one has to go beyond training human resources to the longer-term objective of reforming institutions. In relation to this, objectives could be understood in both concrete and symbolic terms. In symbolic terms, the program has sought to rally progressive students, its research community, and beyond, around the idea and the possibility of higher education that both challenges the limits imposed on intellectual inquiry, our ability to imagine what's like, and how it might unfold. In concrete terms, its stated aim is to train individuals who are grounded in and will embed themselves intellectually or physically, or both, developing living thought on the continent. The aspirations espoused here, as many of you no doubt already know, have been met with massive challenges and resistance, both from within and outside of the program. Anti-imperialism as the necessary trajectory that our scientific community here on the continent must necessarily embrace if we are to survive has been affirmed by many speakers over the course of the last few days. Yet, as we have learned through our own experience at MISA and through Professor Mamdani's institutional and politicized struggles in relation to the MISA program, the enemy of decolonization is not only the imperialist forces arrayed against it. As great an enemy is the resistance to change by those who have both been victims and become eventual beneficiaries of the gradual erosion of higher education. The MISA crisis of 2016 was also deeply a manifestation of struggles among these conservative elements, among whose casualties will have been the best of young brains, but also surviving its most prolific of young minds, some of whom are here today. Professor Mamdani has remained adamant that for both we must fight. It is easy to mystify the successes or failures of programs such as MISA in ways that obscure the intellectual communities it takes to build them. As the University of Dar es Salaam and Makerere University have most often appeared in his writings as pivotal intellectual communities and lineages for him, then we must also, it is through those institutions that his scholarly trajectory became most keenly defined. If we, the communities that have encountered Professor Mamdani, along the lineage of scholarship and intellectual inquiry, have also approached as political the merits of scholarly rigor, sustained intellectual debate, and singular commitment to ideas, no matter how contested they are, we owe this in part to those spaces and his tenure there in the 70s and 80s. The doctoral program he founded at MISA bears the hallmarks of that space and time, of debate, of the critical questioning of everything. There we are all somehow permanent students. Professor Mamdani himself also stubbornly remains a permanent student. Yet there was nothing organically ingrained into the program's vision or structure that would have preempted its emergence at Makerere University, nor nurtured such an environment as it has become. It's common sense, therefore, that the idea of borrowing from other progressive traditions across the continent, or the model traveling to other parts of the continent, evolution in more progressive ways remains possible and indeed necessary. I imagine that if Professor Mamdani were to reflect here on what tasks remain to be done, among the most urgent of those, which is also one of the most sustained pedagogical concerns discernible in his scholarly approach, would be that of our intergenerational obligations. What to do with the younger generation of African scholars. To this task, he has demonstrated that they are no merely symbolic or wishful resolutions, that our responses must both be practical and concrete, and must display a political commitment to intellectual traditions that are historically grounded and relevant for our realities. In my own reading, some of the questions he has raised in the practice of such grounding and which seem to endure across the body of his work, some of which were already mentioned by earlier speakers, include the following. On account of statelessness? How did the colonial state govern, and how does the post-colonial state govern? What kinds of political subjects are produced by historical binaries of belonging and exile, of native settler? And what functions do such categories serve for the powerful when power is inflected with class, race, ethnicity, gender? More on this later. And how do the government and politicized identities in the face of exclusion? And what sorts of inclusion do they seek when constrained by the same structures, conditions, and institutions that produce their subjectivities? How do subjectivities produced in these identitarian ways structure our human experiences? Sorry, I'm looking forward to skip. So much more, or perhaps as much as his contemporaries who have influenced our theoretical traditions, many of whom are sitting here today, Professor Mamdani has, through his own scholarship, shunned and critical that gloss over necessary questions, insisting that scholarly ideas remain open to debate within themselves and across disciplinary boundaries. His responses, critiques of his own work, debate his interlocutors, is a legacy then that we should take seriously. So for instance, when he responded in his seminal work, Citizen and Subject, to the political question of native rule, We have felt obliged in the feminist tradition, this echoes Zen's earlier critique, to show that beyond this, the necessary condition for the stabilization of colonial rule in these social reproductive realms, the exploitation of the unpaid productive and reproductive labor in the service of the migrant wage economy, and the eventual pacification as explanations for the subordinate positions in which ourselves in politics and the economy today, and so on. Beyond this, among the questions and tensions that seem to preoccupy his later scholarship have, might understand the question of relevance of higher education, which was a post-independence nationalist preoccupation versus excellence of higher education, the role of the public intellectual versus that of the scholar, and in this he cautions that we must resist the temptation to dismiss one side and embrace the other, and rather approach these two in dialectical terms, and of course the unfinished business of decolonization. Finally, to recognize Professor Mamdani's insights as traceable to the lineages I've mentioned, Dar es Salaam, Makerere, and right here to Codesria, is to acknowledge that we too at MISA have been substantive beneficiaries of these critical traditions, of the ways in which legacies of critical debate travel across generational time and space. Yet on legacy and drawing experiences elsewhere, we must also confront a number of unavoidable questions. That is, survive their charismatic leaders? Are they intrinsically vulnerable to failure beyond their founders? And resources exist within and beyond the academy that we might draw on to nurture continuity. Not concrete answers to these questions as yet. These are questions that Professor Mamdani has himself seemed to grapple with over the course of the years. Fundamentally, though, the hope he constantly seems to articulate, and which is implicit in the program's model, is that it will be the generations of students who pass through, survive, and define who shall ultimately determine its fate beyond this initial phase of grounding. On this time, in this recognition of Professor Mamdani's contributions by Codesria, a younger generation among us might also reclaim its mission. I think in part it's our claims that we can nurture amongst ourselves, our own communities, the kind of intellect and wish to become. Thank you.
We have a problem here because the Codesria apparatchiks think almost there in terms of time. So, and I promised that I'll allow Mahmood to say something. So, 4 questions. 2 here, and then respond. 1, 2, 3. I want a woman. Oh, okay. You start. 2 minutes, please. Micro.
Okay. There is history about the book, the Codessia history of the book, and which also shows you the complexities of social science work, in Africa. Mahmoud received the Codessia, a Rockefeller-funded program called Reflections on Development. He was, if I remember well, almost at the same time involved in a very big survey of rural Uganda. And I was at his house once, and he had all these documents which were supposed to be, collated and something about that, because there was a huge amounts of information. Somehow along the line, I don't know when, he changed his mind, and I read of his book, which was very different from what I thought he was going to write about. And the title of the book, can I say that, Mamdani? The original title was Apartheid, that the post-colonial regime was described as non-racist apartheid. I was furious. And one morning, with Zen, convinced that there would be a physical fight over the title. I was inappropriate, and I thought that apartheid had a very specific meaning in Africa, that I do not believe that colonialism could be reduced to a non-racist apartheid. Eventually, I don't know why Mamdani changed the title, but the thing with books, like any book, is that people read different things out of it. Eventually, the whole literature now, which reads Mamdani as really being involved in the, indigenous vis-a-vis settler problem, and which of course appears in Mamdani's book. And it's been used mainly in the discussion about land, access to land, whether in fact, in a truly egalitarian or citizen, where people all enjoy the same rights, why would one group of people not be allowed to buy in a country? The so-called settlers could not be able to buy land in the...
You're moving from one to the other now. Could you make a
point? I told you that.
No.
No. The point
you talked about the title, and now you are moving to acquiring land as property.
I don't want to say. What I'm saying is that there's a whole debate about the indigenous and settler. At Mamdani's level was at the national level, which has now been reduced to cover fights that are taking place in Africa between settler and land, and the settler and the indigenous. And I'm saying that because of that, the implicit argument in many of these arguments, and I think also in Mamdani's argument, was that citizenship must somehow involve the extension of rights to purchase land to everybody.
Very much.
I think that was a comma. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. But
yeah. Well, No.
I will be very brief. I would like to make a testimony on one aspect of the career of Mamdani that has not been mentioned, that is the one of the mentor, somebody who has always used to promote African researchers, not just in Africa, but in the USA, where I have known him. So I would make this testimony. I wanted to go to the USA to carry out some studies on the African diaspora, but when I shared with Mahmoud project, he sent me a mail telling me, Usman, do you want a postdoc at Columbia? I said yes, and 2 weeks after, and then after 2 weeks at Columbia, he told me, Usman, do you want a position, a post at Columbia? And then 2 weeks after, I was associate professor at Columbia University. And then a few years after, Ahmad Diouf and Bashir came to join us, and they also had the same African researcher, they asked me if I wanted to stay in Colombia. And 2 weeks after I was appointed there, so I wanted to pay this tribute that he has been somebody who has used all his influence. African researchers. He did not always, has not always been successful, but you know, he had always had this commitment to do so, and I wanted to pay a tribute to him for that. I thank you.
No, no.
Thank you. I agree with Professor Mamadou Diouf about the book Citizen and Subject that really help us to better understand the effects of colonialism in Africa. And I wanted to know what would be an alternative model for successful democratization. Thank you.
Yes, Comrade Samba. No. Please.
Thank you very much. A question to Professor Mamdani. What is the relationship at institutional level between these institutions, research institutions that you have established in Uganda, and another one, the Marcus Garvey Pan-African University, established by the late Dani Wadada Nabudere, and in terms of collaboration and what was eventually the outcome of such collaboration. Now, I think brings back there's been very robust tone within Codesia and outside between, for instance, Ali Mazrui and Ashima Feje. It's also a discussion that we had in 2009 November at UNISA, which I had the responsibility to coordinate for 2 years. And as a member of the scientific committee, I tried to make sure that in addition to a presentation of Sudanese scholars, and we succeeded to do that, and it also impacted on the outcomes of the conference. Now, this issue about indigenous people, yes, we find it everywhere else or in many other parts of the world, but we must see only in Africa that the settlers own almost everything, including land property rights, at the expense of the indigenous people, and we seem to be accommodative, with that. Need about that. Now, the impact of related to that, the impact of ethnicity and race.
Do you have a question?
I don't know. The first question. No, I wanted to make.
Have you made your comment?
No, I haven't finished. But
okay, well, we don't have time, honestly.
Sorry?
There is time. Professor Mamdani, could you respond, please?
I've not forgotten what Jacques said, which is the Dar es Salaam tradition is a vigorous engagement followed by lots of beer. So I'll be waiting for the beer in the evening. But I want to thank Codesria for this opportunity, for this critical engagement with what I have written and what I have done, and with what I have not written and not done. And I'm focused on 5 main issues: gender, tribe, including non-racial apartheid, which Thandika raised, Sheikh Anta Diop, Ifriqiya, and Miser. Okay, these are the 5 issues. As I understand, these are the key issues that have been raised by my interlocutor and from the floor. But first, just a preliminary comment. In the books that have been cited here, and notwithstanding my most recent engagement with higher education and decolonization, I have been focused, my work is focused on 2 major themes. The theme of the civic and the customary, and particularly the question of the customary. Okay. The other is the theme of political identity and political violence through genocide in Rwanda, extreme violence in Darfur. Okay, so begin with the questions raised regarding gender. IB says, I don't talk of minorities, I don't talk of youth, I don't talk of women. Zen says, gender is key to forced labor, and I don't talk about gender. I agree and I don't agree. Let me tell you where I don't agree, and I hope it becomes clear where I agree. My understanding of citizen and subject, central to it is not forced labor. Central to it is the question of the customary. Right. Central to it is the changed structural role of society, of society itself, custom as underlying the capacity of society to solve disputes, local disputes, to maintain order itself, and to reproduce relationships. From that custom law, it becomes part of the state ranged against society, part of the state to discipline society, shape relations within society. The reshaping of the customary addressed 2 particular groups. The customary law reproduced a patriarchal set of relationships as central was tradition. Right. Now, this was my main argument in Citizen and Subject. Now maybe I did not succeed in making it as clearly as possible. That's a question. But I also learned a second thing along the way, which is you cannot be permissive. You cannot claim to be writing about everything. You read what it is you're writing about, and you have to focus on it, but without being blind to the world at large. So I'm not a historian, but I'm not blind to history. I'm not a gender theorist, but I'm not blind to gender. But at some point, I had an ambition of being a gender theorist. Zen will remember this, because Jen will remember that in the 1980s, right, I can't remember the exact, Codesria wanted to promote a project on gender, and there was a retreat. And in the Angelique Savané, Zen, myself, right? And for this retreat, I wrote a paper exclusively on gender, okay? But it was such a narrow view of gender because it looked at gender through the eyes of political economy. And I was slaughtered during that retreat And I came back so wounded, it took me months to recover. And I decided at the end of it that no, look, you can't do everything. Expertise is genius, right? It takes half a lifetime or a lifetime to learn things. And I said, okay. So I moved over to Citizen and Subject, right? Gender informed it, but it was not a book about gender. Okay. But there was a second thing that I learned about gender when I was dealing with political violence, genocide in Rwanda, the extreme violence in Darfur, which is that there is something different about gender, and there is something different about youth. Because I was dealing with politics, I asked myself, could there ever be a genocide of women? Could there ever be a genocide of youth? Any society which follows this project would have spelt its doom immediately, because reproduction would be impossible, right? Gender has to be thought through. It can't be an add-on. That's another conclusion I reached at that point. It cannot be. And when I was talking of genocide, I was talking of genocide of particular political identities, which had been politicized, right? And whose rights and disabilities were reproduced through state law. But then, so this is just to explain, yes, I agree. I'm not a gender scholar, but no, I don't agree. Or have been. I mean, it's not I am, but the work we are discussing. Tribalism. So Ivy says, I talk about success of the post-colonial state in deracializing, but not in detribalizing. And that tribe, ethnicity is universal. Has to be questioned. I don't agree. And I want to take in Tandika's question about non-racial apartheid here, because they're linked. When I studied indirect rule, okay, my understanding was indirect rule was that it came out of a crisis of direct rule and the civilizing mission. And the civilizing mission turned on a single difference, race. And the civilizing mission had a huge disadvantage, which is a tiny minority of the civilized and put together against it a huge majority of the uncivilized, okay, who over time gained the self-consciousness that they were the target of this racialism. And the challenge for the colonial power, and this is a challenge posed after the middle of the 19th century, following a series of revolts, the challenge for the colonial power was, how do you fragment this majority? And the solution, indirect rule, was now to create a second layer of discrimination. First layer was race, and the second layer became tribe. By turning tribe into a unit of local government, by turning tribe into an authority in local government, by turning tribe into a justification for a set of what were called customary laws. And key to this law was that anybody who was not descended from an indigenous to that particular local government unit would not have a customary right to land and would not have the right to participate in representation. Right? And my understanding was that there was no part, literally, of the continent where you had everybody belonging to a single ethnic group. This was a continent of migrations. Everywhere there were minorities, ethnic minorities. And immediately, indirect rule set a majority against a minority in every local unit. And when we got independence, the big debate was between the radical nationalists who said this was a colonial project and and mainstream and conservative nationalists who said, no, this is African tradition. And that has indeed not only survived, it has prospered. It remains a big challenge. When I wrote, actually the book was the same, only the title changed. Okay, Thandika was furious with the title because I said, I think now we can say over. Okay. Over beer. But let me just say one thing. Let me just say one thing, because my point about South Africa was that they had deracialized the state, but they had not detribalized customary law, right? Which was to detribalize customary law would affect three groups. It would affect non-indigenous groups within non-indigenous tribes within the area. It would affect human. These are the three groups that desperately need a detribalization of customary law. Third issue, tribalism. Cheikh Anta Diop. I have Cheikh Anta Diop coming from my attempt to understand what possible sources can we turn to understand pre-colonial Africa. Because Cheikh Anta Diop diversified our sense of sources beyond the textual archive. He turned our attention to language. He turned our attention to multiple things. But I have a disagreement when it comes to the corpus of Cheikh Anta Diop. I understand Cheikh Anta Diop is an archive of civilization within Africa. The way the Europeans constructed an archive of civilization and I think he turned the European project upside down. I think that was a mistake because in my view, and I teach at Miser, I teach a first-year course called Major Debates in the Study of Africa. And it begins with not with Cheikh Anta, with Du Bois. Du Bois, Cheikh Anta, Martin Bernal, those sets of debates. It's interesting that Du Bois comes before Cheikh Anta. Cheikh Anta never acknowledges Du Bois. Bernal comes after Cheikh Anta. Bernal never acknowledges Du Bois or Cheikh Anta, okay? But Du Bois, to me, was the closest to what I consider to be the way we need to understand civilization. Because civilization, in my view, does not have, okay? It is pointless to look for the origin of civilization. The origin of civilization is which will not pay us anything because civilization emerges at the confluence of different traditions, right? It emerges in the Nile Delta where you have a confluence. It emerges at different places through a confluence, whether it's the European Renaissance, whatever it is. So I have a disagreement here. And it's a productive disagreement, but that's why what I've done does not reflect this. Ifriqiya, I just want to say one thing, which is that Ifriqiya is not about, it's about pre-colonial, Mamadou is right, but it's not about Arabic-speaking pre-colonial. No, it's about pre-colonial Africa. But Ifriqiya has begun with two focuses. One is West Africa, North Africa, the Sahara, okay? And the other is East Africa, the Indian Ocean, okay? The first is parts of it anyway, significant. The second, not really. Miser is a work in progress, and any worthy endeavor should be known by the challenges it faces. We faced a lot of challenges. One of our funders, Carnegie, I recently had a meeting in New York City because I spent 4 months at Columbia and 8 months in Kampala. So I had a meeting with them, and the Carnegie person asked me, she said, you know, Mahmood, if you had known all the challenges you would face at Miser, would you have taken up the job? So I looked at her and I said, if I had known everything we achieved, yes, I would have taken up the job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess Kodeswe has to do the normal ritual of presenting you with something. So would you come on? Zena? You have been a very close comrade of Mahmoud, so, and of course, a matriarch of Kodeswe. So I would hand this over to you to present to Mzee Mahmood Mamdani.
Have it in your library. And this friendship is out there.
Why not? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdullah.